evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to our first ever New York Tech Meetup NASDAQ Conversations with Women in Tech. Thank you for coming. I'm Jessica Lawrence, and I am the Managing Director of New York Tech Meetup. When New York Tech Meetup was founded in 2004 by Don Barber, who's sitting here in the front, and Scott Heiferman, it was an organization with two members sitting around a conference table talking about the tech companies that they were building. And now in 2012, we are the biggest meetup in the world with almost 25,000 members. And we are also a nonprofit that supports the city's rapidly growing tech industry. If you know about us already, it's probably because of our often and actually always sold out monthly demo events at the Skirball Theater at NYU, or because you see my name come across your inbox in our bi-weekly newsletters. But we're also working very consistently behind the scenes, advocating for the tech community, helping our members connect with each other and with the resources that they need to be successful, and in general, just trying to work and make sure that the tech ecosystem of the city really has significant impact, not just for the people that are working in it, but for all of the people of New York. So tonight we have an interesting program. You know, a lot of times events like this are set up as pure panels. And after going to lots of conferences, I found that panel discussions sometimes leave me wanting to know more of the story, because you end up hearing things in little sound bites, and you never get to hear the full arc of what someone is talking about. So we're starting tonight with stories from 5 different speakers, 4 women and 1 man. We have Amy Quispe, Cindy Gallup, Tara Hunt, Rachel Sklar, and Anil Dash. And they're all going to tell you different stories, share a different perspective, all with the thread of the theme of the state of women in tech. And after they all speak, we'll do Q&A so that you have some time to interact with them. We've kept this audience small so that it can feel a lot more like a conversation, instead of us being in a gigantic auditorium where you don't get to know the people around you and you can't really interact well with the speakers. But before I have them come up and speak, I'm actually going to tell you my own story, because I've had a lot of questions about why we're even having this conversation, why conversations about women in tech still matter, and why we're having this series of events in particular. And even for myself, I didn't realize a year ago when I started in this position as New York Tech Meetup's first full-time paid employee and first managing director, how much my past life's work would collide with my current life's work and inform it in such an amazing way. So if you were to rewind the highlight reel of my life back about 7 or 8 years, you wouldn't have found me up on a stage. You would have found me that summer in an engineering lab, surrounded by 30 giggling 11 and 12-year-old girls. And I was about to lead these girls out of our air-conditioned sanctuary of a lab into the heat of the Southern California summer. And that hunting expedition wasn't to hunt deer or bears or wild boar. It was to hunt for bugs. And not your average bug, but an engineering bug, a design bug. These 30 girls were enrolled in an engineering program that was immersing them in all different types of engineering. And our first step was to have them create a bug list, a list of the things in the world that bugged them. And as we walked around, the girls had to pick out things, that a doorknob was too high, that their sneaker rubbed their foot in the wrong way, and start keeping track of those on their bug list. Because their bug list was going to inform an invention of their own design that they were going to create later in the program. As we went through that process, one of these girls, Emily, pulled one of her mentors aside, who was a female engineering student. And she said, you know, my mom doesn't have a place to put her purse in our minivan. Is that a design flaw? And the mentor said, of course it's a design flaw. And the girl said, well, how come there's no place for my mom to put her purse? And the mentor said, well, most engineers are men. And most men don't have purses that they need to store in their minivans while they're driving. So Emily said, and this light bulb just went off, and she said, so wait, someone designs the minivan? And if a person designs the minivan, that means I could design the minivan, and I could design it differently, and I could design a place for my mom's purse? So she was onto something, and on to the first reason why we're here tonight, which is that Emily couldn't be what she couldn't see. She didn't know about engineers in general, but she certainly didn't know that women became engineers and designed things like automobiles. And if we ever want to change the ratio and see a different number of women in tech, we have to do a better job of hearing women's voices, seeing women in tech, and seeing the women that are here now. Because I think the mistake that is made is that because the percentage is low, people act as if it's zero. And it's not zero. There's a huge community of women in tech building amazing things here in the city. So we need to have people planning conferences and people who are creating lists of the country's biggest innovators and builders realize that there are qualified women that they can include right now, whether they want to see it or not. So that leads me to what I'm working on now with New York Tech Meetup, and what I didn't see when I first started working with the organization. So when I joined, I started looking at the spreadsheet of applications that we get in, and I started scanning it for women's names, and saw almost no one. And when I looked at who was up on stage demoing, it was almost no women. And when I looked out in our audience, it was a little bit better, 25, 27% women, but still not that great. And so I started asking women. I put out a call to a huge group of women and said, we want your applications, come demo at New York Tech Meetup. I even emailed friends that I knew were building amazing tech startups and said, please, please, come demo, we're friendly, we want you up on stage. And I was met with mostly silence. Nobody really came forward. And as I kept going through this process of trying to seek out women and getting a few women's applications in here and there, I noticed a couple of things. The first thing was that when I did get a woman applying, and I had to reject her for some reason, even if it was just that our schedule was full and that she was applying too late, I almost never heard from her again, which was very different from what happened to guys. With guys, I would hear from them before they applied, the day they applied, the day after they applied, and then if I told them that they couldn't come, I'd hear from them over and over and over again. And I even had one guy who emailed me for 28 days straight with a different, well-thought-out, multi-paragraph argument every single day with why his company should demo at New York Tech Meetup. So I started wondering if this was an anomaly, if this was something that was unique to the New York Tech Meetup experience for some reason. And then I met June Cohen at TED, who curates programming for TED. And I thought, surely, if there is any organization that is looking for speakers that doesn't have a problem getting women, it would be TED. Who would say no to speaking at TED? But June very quickly told me that she'll ask 5 guys to speak at TED, and they'll all say yes. And she'll ask 5 women to speak at TED, and they'll all say no. And there are a multitude of reasons for this. But I think one of the core reasons actually brings me back to my days at Girl Scouts, and something that I heard from the former White House Press Secretary Dee Dee Myers when she was talking about women who run for political office. And what she said is that if a woman runs for office, she's just as likely to win the election as a man. But the hurdle is getting her to run in the first place. And if you give a woman a list of 5 attributes that are essential to being elected, if she looks at that list and says, you know, I've only got 4 out of 5, I think I'll wait. I'm not going to run right now. I really need to up my game, and I really need to have 5 out of 5. That's what a woman will say. Give the same list to a guy. He will look at that list, and he will say, oh, I got 2 out of 5. I'm good. Sign me up. I'm running. So this is evidence that I see all the time at New York Tech Meetup. And I've come to the conclusion that I don't think we have an aspiration gap or an ambition gap. I think that we have a confidence gap and a comfort gap. And that comfort gap actually came into full view for me recently when I decided to do a bit of an experiment. I decided to have a women's demo night. Small, intimate, only women's companies demoing. So I put out a call for applications, kind of expecting not to get very much. And all of a sudden, I had 37 applications from women-founded startups, most of whom had never applied to demo at New York Tech Meetup, and most of whom I had never heard of before. So they're not applying to the main stage, but they're willing to apply to the small event that's intimate and women only. So I started asking them, why? Why didn't you apply to New York Tech Meetup to demo? And their answer is, it's big, it's scary, it's all men, and I'm not ready yet. And I know from looking at all of these applications that 99% of the women who say I'm not ready yet were ready a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And as I looked at the companies that demoed, I talked to women more and more and talked to them about this difference between the main stage at New York Tech Meetup and this women's demo event. And one woman said to me that the biggest challenge that she felt was that as this anomaly of one of the only women to get up on the stage at New York Tech Meetup, she felt the weight of not only being judged about her own presentation and her own business and her own thoughts, but she felt that in doing her presentation, her entire gender was going to be judged based on her performance. And so as I move forward and look at that, and look at why we're having this conversation tonight and why we're doing these events about women in tech, to me, it's about closing that confidence gap and closing that comfort gap. And Girl Scout Research Institute actually just came out with an interesting study that backs up that idea. So they asked high school girls how interested they were in science, technology, engineering, and math. 74% of high school-age girls said they had a high level of interest in careers in STEM. And yet we see only 12% of computer science engineering degrees going to women. So where's that disconnect? Where's that difference between the 74% interest and the 12% of people that are graduating with engineering degrees who happen to be female? And when they dug a little bit deeper into what girls were seeing, girls reported that they still saw a gender gap, that they still couldn't see themselves in that environment, and that made them uncomfortable. A lot of people assume that women don't go into STEM careers because they're worried about work-life balance. But another recent study that just came out of MIT showed that, in fact, the biggest reason why women don't go into STEM careers is because they don't feel comfortable. So that comfort is not just a warm and fuzzy thing. That comfort, to me, is something much deeper. And it's a huge hurdle to getting this ratio to be more balanced. And part of that comfort is something that I didn't really understand when I first started working in tech. Because I came from a very protected environment at Girl Scouts. I was around 95% women all the time. And then I switched to an environment that was 95% men. And I was still relatively protected because people were coming to me, asking me to demo their companies. I wasn't having to go and really ask anybody for anything. But then I started hearing stories of women doing pitches in front of VCs and angel investors, and hearing some of the stories that came back about the remarkably uncomfortable situations that they were put in. A woman who was there to give a pitch being asked to fetch the coffee. A woman speaking to an angel investor about her company and being told how hot she looks in her skirt. Or being asked who was taking care of the kids if she wasn't at home to do it. Or being propositioned for a date in the middle of a business conversation. And had I not heard this enough and heard it from women I trusted, I wouldn't have really believed that these were conversations from 2012. I would have thought they were conversations from 1950 or 1960. And that's the other reason why we're having these conversations and why we're here tonight. because I think that it's important that we speak more about the truth. Most women aren't going to come forward and talk about this because they're afraid of being blacklisted if they speak up about what happens behind those closed doors. And to me, this is also about getting that out there so that we can then elevate the conversation and start having a conversation that gets beyond pitting women against men or saying that men are bad and women are great, that gets beyond what some people might think is a stereotypical kind of angry feminist conversation and gets much more into the practical of helping that 11-year-old girl who really wants to be an engineer get past that ridiculous hurdle of feeling uncomfortable so that she can actually step into that career that she wants. So as I've been looking at what's happening with women in tech, I've paid a lot of attention to what Sheryl Sandberg has said. And that's not because Sheryl is the only voice in this room that talks about tech, but she is a loud voice, and a lot of women pay attention to her. So it's interesting to see what her perspective is. And one of the things that I noticed looking at Sheryl's speeches is that if you look at what she talked about 2 years ago and what she's talking about now, she's talking about a lot of the same things. She likes to refer very frequently to the fact that even in a home where both parents are working, the woman still does twice as much housework and 3 times as much childcare. She talks about how the percentage of female CEOs in Fortune 500 companies is less than 4%. So I started thinking, why does Sheryl do this? Why does she keep using these same statistics? And I don't think it's just a tool of it being good information for a presentation, that it's good content. The bottom line is that she's using the same facts because the facts haven't changed. So there are still people that haven't heard this information. And there are still people that, because they haven't heard this information, haven't been able to get to the point yet where they understand that this is actually a conversation about something much bigger than women. This is a conversation about the fact that the world has dramatically changed, our economy has dramatically changed, and all of our systems from work to education were built for a different reality. And all of that is shifting. So what I hope from tonight is that you'll hear something that gives you pause, that you can keep in the back of your mind so that you might ask a question differently or give an answer differently or think about something from a slightly different perspective. Because my hope is that as we've seen that almost all tech conversations in the past have been conversations about men in tech, and we are finally having conversations about women in tech, which is great. But my hope is that we can finally get to the point where we can just have conversations about tech, and that both men and women and people of all genders and all ages can feel like they have a comfortable seat at that table together. So with that, that is why we are here, and I am now going to introduce Rachel, our first speaker.